This unit is the nervous system, and we will move on to the immune system as well. We do not cover all of anatomy and physiology in AP biology, but we talk about some systems that allow us to look into some more biological processes. So we're going to talk about the nervous system first. You will have just a nervous system test, and this is the beginning of that content. There's about 6 PowerPoints that go over this. So Dr. Rufus B. Weaver and this person, Harriet, we are looking at, if you look on the right, an image of all of the nerves. And this was a special project because someone donated their body to science, Harriet, and this professor was an anatomy professor, and he basically painstakingly removed everything except for the nervous system, which nerves are super, super thin strands, as you can see. If you can imagine painstakingly removing all of this, it's an exhausting task. So there are specimens like that in different museums, but it takes a very long time to isolate the nervous system. The core of what we're learning today is that animals have a nervous system that detects external and internal signals, transmits and integrates that information, and then produces a response. So it's basically a chain reaction, either to a internal stimuli, something that's going on inside our body, or an external stimuli. You touch something hot, you respond in a certain way. What is the role of the nervous system? The nervous system interacts with that sensory information, and it coordinates responses and behaviors. And so the most basic research of the nervous system was Pavlov's dogs, classical conditioning. And if you know anything about that, it was a guy who basically would ring a bell and provide food for a dog at the same time. The food would create a salivation response, that's a nerve system response, and eventually just the bell conditioned the dog to start salivating. And essentially what it did was it associated salivation just with the noise, not necessarily with the food. And we see that at its very basic level, the nervous system is just a response to a stimuli. Trends that we see in the evolution of the nervous system, thinking back to evolution, we see a very general nerve net in our most basic organisms, and then we start to see organization and concentration of neurons in certain areas. We see that we get bilateral symmetry by the time we get to our salamander, our squid, which is basically a plane down the center and things branching off. We also get a brain, we get larger nerves and a central nerve cord, and then ganglia working off of that, whereas we see our nerve net and our C-star, very basic organization. Things to note in development: an increase in ganglia, which is basically just an increase in nervous cells, which means an increase in sensory reception. If I only have one nerve per fingertip, my ability to sense things is going to be very low, whereas tons of nerves is going to allow me to sense things much more sensitively. We also see increased cephalization, which is essentially the concentration of nerves in the anterior region, basically the development of a brain where things start to develop. What's the advantage of having cephalization? Essentially, this is going to allow us to organize and process things in a more organized manner. The human nervous system is divided into 2 parts, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system being the brain and spinal cord, peripheral nervous system being cranial nerves, which is all of the nerves that are in your face and process information, any ganglia, and spinal nerves, so anything branching off from our spinal cord. The basic pathway that we see in the nervous system is we have sensory receptors, and right now the eye, it would be an external stimuli. This can also happen on the internal, right? I eat food, that is an internal thing that's going on, still sensory input. We have integration, which in humans occurs in the brain, which is basically processing that information, and then the motor output. What is the response to the effector muscle? Typically, the sensory inputs of the blue and the orange are going to be peripheral nervous system based activities, whereas the processing, the integration is always going to be central nervous system. This image shows the reflex arc, which is super important in what is focused on the AP test. There are 5 steps that we need to know. What we know is that there's the arrival of the stimulus and the activation of a certain receptor, which is the very end or the terminal end of a nerve. to the activation of the sensory neuron. So after the receptor or the very end of the nerve is stimulated, the sensory neuron is going to send a message. Basically, it goes all the way through that neuron, through the dorsal root, which is basically the connector between that neuron and the spinal ganglia, which brings us right to the spinal cord. Once we get to the spinal cord, in step 3, we see that the information moves up the spinal cord into the brain to be processed by the central nervous system. That information is then sent through a motor neuron. It goes through the ventral root, which is the end of the motor neuron that's connected to our spinal cord. Goes through the motor neuron and it activates the effector muscle, and that's where we see our response. The general definition of a neuron is the basic cell that makes up our nervous system. The structure allows for detection, generation, transmission, and integration of signal information. What do we need to know about this? We see that in this image in the purple, as well as this image, same thing. This image is probably a little bit more like what it actually looks like, but we'll go over it in this image. We see the dendrites are the information receivers, the receptors where information shows up, and it brings it right to the cell body, which has a nucleus and organelles. That nucleus and organelles is going to process that information, and it's going to send that message in an electrical signal down the axon, which conducts action potentials away from the cell body towards the axon terminals, which end up having a synapse or a connection with the next target cell. Something that's important is that the message that is received at the dendrites, which is the very end, is a chemical message, usually a neurotransmitter. Once it enters into the cell body, it becomes an electrical signal. That electrical signal moves down the axon, and then what's released at the end on the axon terminals is also a chemical message. So it's chemical, electrical, chemical messages moving through a neuron. This also talks about the 3 types of neurons: sensory, the one that gathers the information, interneurons, which are the neurons that are basically supporting that message moving to or from a certain location, and then motor neurons are the neurons that are sending the message and enacting whatever response we want to see. Neurons are highly specialized and they conduct certain impulses. The 3 types which we talked about, sensory, inter, and motor neurons. We'll get a little bit more in depth in that later. The 2 most important parts are sensory and motor neurons, which we've talked about. Obviously, identifying the 3 types of neurons in this reflex arc. Blue is going to be your sensory neuron. The green inside of your spinal cord is going to be your interneuron, and then the red would be your motor neuron. There are 5 steps, 3 neurons involved. Take a moment, answer this question, see where you're at. What are some noticeable differences between a normal cell and our neural cell? Obviously, the cell body and the things contained within it are similar to any other cell that we have, but what's important to remember is that all of the parts branching off of that cell body are very specialized to do a certain job, which is sending messages, and that's what makes the neuron so special. We've gone over the parts of the neuron, but one very important thing is to look at the synapse, which is the connection between the axon terminal and the next cell's dendrites. They actually do not touch. There's a small space in between where chemicals are released into that open space. They're released by the axon terminal and they're received by the dendrites of the next cell. That chemical is received and it turns it into an electrical signal which moves it to the next cell. We call that first cell our presynaptic cell, and the cell that's receiving that message the postsynaptic cell. If you need to, take a minute, identify these structures. A typical neuron has a cell body, axons, and dendrites. Many axons have something called a myelin sheath. There's only a few types of neurons that do not have it. These are basically electrical insulators. Think about any cord you've had, and maybe you've seen the plastic start to wear away to expose just the wires. Just the wires are going to be your axon, and that plastic coating is going to be your myelin sheath. And they're actually, they look like beads on the axon. Each cell is the myelin sheath, and they're made by what's called a Schwann cell. It basically makes this insulation that conducts the message faster. The gaps between each myelin sheath made by the Schwann cells are called nodes of Ranvier, and basically they have a certain purpose, which we will talk about at a later date. Again, taking a look at this myelin sheath made by the Schwann cells, allow for the conduction of messages very quickly. To get into what the nodes of Ranvier do, we want to talk about saltatory conduction, which is basically the way that that electrical signal moves down the axon. Interestingly enough, what happens is that the message can technically skip from one node to the next. It moves very quickly through the myelinated area and then jumps to the next area. We'll talk more about saltatory conduction when we talk about depolarization and repolarization, but the idea to remember is that saltatory conduction is how the message moves down the axon. Think for a moment, answer these questions to yourself. We will resume talking a little bit more specifically about the nervous system after this.